Richard, as you all know, is the chair of the Socialist Campaign Group, a former Shadow Cabinet member, a long-time Socialist MP, one of the most consistent sort of fighters for social justice in Parliament, and a valuable voice on the left. And we're very happy to have him here with us today. Also really happy to be joined by Vic Chechi Ribeiro, who's a very experienced and militant trade unionist with the NEU. A teacher and a Labour Party momentum activist who's been on the ground, like all of you have the last 5 years, arguing for socialism, building that movement strength, and is going to bring a really unique rank and file perspective, I think, to this conversation. So happy to have you here, Vic. Also got Katie Clark. Now, I first saw Katie speak in 2013 at a protest in Sussex, when we were protesting some of the changes that were being made to higher education at the time. Katie was then a member of Parliament and was one of the few MPs that consistently stood with students, with workers, with all sorts of people fighting for social, economic and racial justice. Really happy to say that in May, Katie was elected back into the Scottish Assembly, or into the Scottish Assembly for the first time, as the MSP for West Lothian, west of Scotland, and was also chair of the Democracy Review, as well as a long-time sort of stalwart of the Labour left. Glad to have you here. And very briefly, my name's Andrew. I'm Momentum's political coordinator, was a Labour advisor for a few years, and also helped sort of set up the first World Transformed and a few others. So I'm here to chair the conversation, to get the best out of the speakers, and also to hear from you. Because after an hour of having a bit of a back and forth with these speakers, you'll get the chance to ask your own questions or make your own contributions. And we'll bring the mic around the floor and widen the discussion out a little bit. So I think before we get started, just say a couple of things. And the one thing I do want to say is reiterate that point that it's been a tough 12 to 18 months. And we're consistently told that we were kind of loose in the head to have supported Jeremy. But we now know it goes well beyond Jeremy. It was about those ideas and our belief that we all share that we can do better than simply being Capital's B team or supporters for the status quo. And this festival, I think, is about reaffirming that commitment, coming together and reminding ourselves that we're in the right here, we're on the right side of history. And I think that this conference, as bad as it can get, will sort of reaffirm those collective bonds that we need for another 12 months of struggle, because I'm not going anywhere, and I don't think any of you are, and nor should we, because everything to play for and everything to fight for. Now, the way this is going to work, I'll ask each of the speakers questions. They can come in on any question they like. And we've also got a few more specific questions that will hopefully get the best out of the backgrounds and experiences of the speakers on the stage. And I'm going to go into a question, which I think is for everybody to answer. And I'll come to Richard first, if that's okay. And it's been well documented that large parts of the media, the political establishment, and even the Labour Party were against Jeremy Corbyn and our movement, a socialist Labour Party. Looking back over these last 5 years, is there anything we could have done differently to have achieved better results in 2019? What can we do next time round to make sure that we don't fall short at that last hurdle?
Well, thanks very much. And can I actually open my remarks by saying, isn't it fantastic that we're all together again? Isn't it wonderful? And let's have a round of applause, if it's not too early, for Andrew and the whole TWT team for making this happen. Because it's been so hard, hasn't it? So hard seeing the very unwelcome political developments whilst all being separate from each other. So it's great that we're here together. Andrew asks what could have been done differently. I think one of the things that could have been done differently is collectively as a movement, perhaps the power of the establishment was underestimated. That's something I think will not take place again. And we need to learn the positive lessons of the last few years as well. Many things happened which people said could never happen. They said you can never get a left-wing leader of the Labour Party. We did. They said you could never get a left-wing manifesto. We did. They said you could never get millions and millions of people enthused and active in that politics, and we did. They said you can never get young people to increase the proportions in which they vote, and we did. And we nearly won power in 2017. We came within a hair's breadth of that happening. And I remember, being a a left-wing activist in the Labour Party before as an MP. And my friends, who I respect and love dearly, saying, you're wasting your time as a left-winger in the Labour Party. And I tell you what, on the night that I was elected in 2015 as a Labour MP, I didn't think, and I don't think anybody thought, whatever they claim now, on that evening when we lost in 2015, that in a few months we'd have a left-wing leader, and that left-wing leader could be called, would be Jeremy Corbyn. So we've got to understand that things can change, that everything's to play for. In terms of what we could have done differently, I think we've got to make sure that we never again, collectively, underestimate the establishment. I'll come on to that later, but suffice to say, it's no small thing, is it, when you're trying to get somebody with Jeremy's anti-war internationalist politics as a Prime Minister of a country that has a permanent seat on the UN Security Council with the power of veto. That means we faced enormous establishment pressures, and that was reflected in the right-wing press. And so there are lessons to be learnt, but there are plenty of positives to take from it as well. The key thing is that millions and millions of people can be activated by those positive ideas. That the left does have an alternative, that we gained 3 million votes in 2017 with a transformative programme. I think the ultimate lesson is not to give up. We've had setbacks before, we'll have setbacks again, but we'll also have advances. And at this moment of crisis, more than ever, it's the left that has the practical policies and ideas to solve the crises that people are living through day in, day out.
Thanks, Richard. We'll go to Katie next at the end, then on to Vic.
Thank you. I think the first thing to say is that lots of mistakes were made over the Corbyn years. I think different people in the audience, different people in the panel will have, different views about what were the most important mistakes. We're always going to make mistakes. That's the nature of the way things are. But the main lesson that we have to take is really to reinforce the view that I think socialists have always understood, which is the lengths that the state will go to stop left-wing ideas. I was a member of the Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs for 10 years between 2005 and 2015. So I was involved in numerous attempts to try and get a left-wing candidate onto the ballot paper. Because what we always knew was that if we could get a candidate onto the ballot paper, anything could happen. And of course, in 2015, that's exactly what happened. I had been a Scottish Labour MP, and I was one of the MPs that lost their seat in 2015 in the SNP landslide there. And the Labour Party was in that place in 2015. It was at rock bottom. And I think what we've got to remember is it wasn't just the registered supporters that got Jeremy Corbyn elected. It was trade union activists. It was long-time members of the Labour Party who had never voted for a left candidate before, but were really attracted to the straight-talking, honest politics campaign with radical policies that was run in 2015. And I think we need to remember the hope of that campaign, the insurgency of that campaign that was bottom-up. And that when we are at our best, when we talk about the issues, actually people who would never have dreamed of looking to socialists for leadership are willing to put their faith in us. So the question was, could we have done things differently and won in 2019? There are many, many things we could have done differently. I was involved in the 2015 campaign. I then became Jeremy Corbyn's political secretary at the beginning of November 2015. So I was involved in the office politics, the background side of it. Many stories to tell about that. I assure you we made many mistakes and we could have done many things better. And there's many lessons to be learned. I was involved in the Democracy Review. I headed up the Democracy Review. A major lesson we have to learn is that we need to make sure that we fight and deliver democracy within the Labour Party. Because much of the Democracy Review was never implemented. It's still not been implemented. Indeed, it may well be that at this conference we may lose some of the things that we achieved. So I think in terms of lessons to be learnt, we must recognise we always need to fight for democracy. My view is that actually we should have tried to stop that 2019 general election. In 2017, we had a snap general election. And I was involved in the discussions internally about that general election. And what we knew was we had to make that general election about class politics and about hope. Because if it was a Brexit general election that split the working class, that would get us into a bad place. So my personal view is that that general election in 2019 that was framed as a Brexit general election was always going to be difficult for us because our class were divided. I'm sure we'll go on and discuss that more, but thank you for allowing me to contribute today.
Thanks, Katie. Thank you. And there's a couple of key points that Katie raised there about the democracy review, about Scotland, about the power of the establishment, and we'll touch on those issues later on in the conversation. Definitely dig a little deeper there, hopefully. Vic, do you want to give us your intake or take on what we should have done differently or could have done differently in the last 5 years?
Yeah, good question. I think over the last 5 years or so, look at positives. We have. Look at the left, what it was like before 2015 in terms of having an area and a view of socialist politics. The Corbyn years allowed those politics becoming mainstream, ideas around public ownership, but by extension, democratisation of society and the economy. These are sort of things and ideas that are now in the mainstream, which is really, really positive. However, what the Corbyn moment allowed was almost a bit of a loophole into power. So we knew that on the ground, in workplaces, in our communities, the left is institutionally weak. It still is. However, there's opportunity there through Westminster to have socialist politics, and unfortunately we came up short in 2019 for that reason. And I think many of us who went on the doorstep, door knocking, speaking to people about socialism, what it meant in terms of people's communities and their day-to-day lives, found that gap. So what needs to happen now, because I sort of see the Corbyn years as an opening chapter. For a lot of people, entering politics, their entry point into socialism. Now, the question is, what do we do now? So I'm interested in this festival around, what do we do now? And for me, it's about building our own organisation that's independent of the Labour Party. Building a left-wing ecology, for example, in local areas that looks at things like, because us as individuals, we're not just Labour Party members, some of us aren't, we're also tenants. Some of us are racialised, some of us are LGBT+. So these are existing struggles that we all have against capital. So what we need to be able to do is to build those struggles, unite them, and politicise as many people as possible. And that's what I hope to sort of speak around today, sort of in my experience, working in a school, being a trade unionist. You see that when you do these things and you politicise people around these issues, you give them their own individual agency, that they understand that their day-to-day struggle, and you connect it to other people and you build those bonds of solidarity, because ultimately, a big reason we came short in 2019 is that that social fabric, that organisation of working class people has been hollowed out by neoliberalism. So the task now is to rebuild that, not only within the Labour Party, but outside of it, because you mentioned the press and attacks, etc., so we're strong enough to withstand them on our own. Because one of the big lessons over the last few years is that in terms of building socialism, and that's what we're here to do, we're here to transform the world. I want to abolish capitalism. That's why I'm here speaking to you today. What we need to do is understanding that it's got to come from ourselves. There's not going to be a leader that's going to come from the sky. There's not a theory that's going to drop. We've got to work it ourselves so we win. And I want to win. Thank you.
Thanks, Vic. Now, Katie, you touched on Brexit there, and I don't want to make all of this conversation about Brexit. It's been hashed out to death over the last 18 months, but we also can't avoid it. And the one thing that you talked about is how Brexit cut across Labour's working class support. And we know, looking at the data, that more than any other party, the Labour Party's voter base was split. I think it's roughly 60-70% towards Remain, 30-40% towards Leave, but in some areas under first past the post, the majority of Labour voters, or nearly the majority of Labour voters, were Leave voters. I spent the general election for 2 months up in Hemsworth. We had a 10,000 majority there, John Trickett's seat. It was just below 1,000 by the time the 2019 election was done. And I'm going to put this question to all of you. Could we have done anything to avoid that fracture of that coalition, that voting coalition? And did it indicate that we were never as strong as we thought we were in the first place, that Brexit so easily kind of split apart the base of our movement? And I'll put that to Katie first, because you did touch on it.
I'm not sure if Brexit split apart the base of our movement. I don't think it necessarily split the Labour left or the Labour movement or the trade unions as such, because I think whatever individuals' view on the Brexit debate and however they voted, the primarily reason that they're involved in politics isn't about constitutional issues. I say that as a Scottish Labour representative, where the Constitution in Scotland is a massive issue that dominates the political debate. And, you know, socialists don't get involved in politics usually because of constitutional issues. They get involved because they want to transform society internationally, and they, you know, they don't believe in borders, really. I mean it's a huge debates that, you know, we obviously need to grapple with. In 2017, I think we managed to put together a position that brought people together, and actually a lot of the Remain vote voted with us in 2017, but we also kept, you know, what became known as the red wall areas in general. There was obviously long-term issues there in terms of, you know, the decline of Labour support in some of these working class communities in the north. So I think the way that we came to our position in 2019 was clearly not one that was able to relate and, you know, reach into both camps. And I think we had an incredibly challenging situation. We had London, where we've got a huge level of support, which was very Remain in the main. We have Scotland, where, you know, we're trying to win support back. And Scotland voted Remain. In the independence campaign in 2014, the No campaign promised that Scotland would be a nation of equals with the rest of the UK. Yet when the referendum took place in 2016, you know, there was no question that it mattered whether the different nations of the UK voted different ways. Scotland voted to remain in the EU. That continues to be a massive issue there. So we were dealt a hand that we had not created, that was dealt to us by the Tories. And I think we needed to recognise that different communities wanted very different things. And our position, I think, needed to be a coherent and consistent position that we argued over years. And I think because of the democratic processes in the Labour Party, that didn't happen. So I think by the time of the 2019 general election, actually, there was a lot of confusion about Labour's position. I think people didn't necessarily think we were principled. I think the reason Jeremy was so popular in the early days was because, and I keep saying it, you know, the straight-talking, honest politics. I think, you know, we need to be straight with people, and people need to believe we have integrity and that we're principled. And actually, people will support us even when they don't always agree with us, if we think we're being straight with them and that we're on their side. So I think we had huge challenges. I think we probably could have got it better in some ways, in that if we'd had a more coherent position for a longer period of time that we argued. That is difficult in a democratic party, and we, you know, we're at a conference, and conference actually, to a large extent, decided the policy that we ran that general election on. In 2017, we had no democratic policy, so therefore we were able to craft the policy in a different way, and we were trying to find a position that we felt would work for as many people as possible in the country. So yes, we could have done things better, but I do think the challenge was massive.
Thanks, Katie. And I'll put that to you, Vic, next on. Could we have done anything to solve that conundrum of Brexit splitting our voter base? And did it reveal the weakness of the project we were involved in?
Yeah, I think, no, I'd agree with what Katie said. It was, you know, a difficult position to be in, maybe more coherent, consistent position would have been the better thing to do. But I think, you know, in terms of the softness of our Brexit support, I think really revealed the lack of political education in our movement, across the movement, in terms of, so many people saw the EU being a bastion of anti-racist values, which is a complete bizarre thing considering the EU's role in terms of borders and migration camps and turning back refugee boats, as well as eviscerating Greece, for example. For the EU to become, for a lot of people, their identity in terms of anti-racism, they really revealed our lack of political education. That would have been done previously in things like trade union meetings, as well as community organisations as well. But also it highlighted a democracy deficit as well, in terms of that Brexit vote was, for many people, their first act of political agency, for example. And for us to then say, actually, we might go back on that. That created huge problems. So there's lessons there to be learned in terms of us as a left, in terms of really centering democracy, giving people a say over their lives as much as possible and connecting it to a socialist project, as well as the need for socialist political education as well. Too many, if we're looking at the Labour Party, I would describe a significant number of Labour Party members as liberals. We sort of witnessed that in Keir Starmer's leadership in terms of the number who voted for him. So there's work for us to do in terms of being clear and articulate what socialism is. Isn't more public spending, and it's certainly not more police officers, okay? It's about democratisation, about giving people a say in, controlling the means of production. We want to control society. It should be workers running things, shouldn't it? But we've got to make that clear. If it's not us doing it, who is?
Thanks, Vic. And I'll come to you, Richard, on that Brexit. What could we have done differently to sort of solve that tension within our base? And did it reveal the weakness of our movement, or is there something different at play there?
Well, I think it was incredibly hard, wasn't it? Because we were the only political party, the only major political party that represented both communities that voted overwhelmingly to leave and communities that voted overwhelmingly to remain. My own seat voted 64% to leave. And so I wasn't surprised at Labour voters or a proportion of them wanting to vote leave. I know that other MPs were surprised. I wasn't surprised about it. But I do think that that Brexit election was a one-off. It became an election defined by 3 words, didn't it? Defined very ably by the Conservatives: get Brexit done. And that enabled them to cut through and confuse people who actually supported our transformative economic policies and our transformative policies on living standards and the economy, because all the opinion polls show that. I don't think that that very unique Brexit election, I don't think those kind of circumstances will be repeated again. But when the question comes as to, did it divide the working class? I think to understand this question and to understand the task that faces us as a left and as a movement, we need to understand what the working class is. I think in some of these conversations, and I say this as somebody from the constituency, which is one of the most economically deprived in England and that voted 64% to leave and qualifies as being in the north because it's from Leeds, I think we run the risk of misunderstanding what working class means, because sometimes people talk about working class seats in the north, and of course there are working class seats in the north, but the majority of society is working class. We've got to be careful as socialists not to accidentally fall into the Thatcherite definition of working class, which is that the working class isn't a majority with the potential to transform society, but it's somehow the poorest 20%. Now, the poorest 20% are part of the working class, but that is not the whole of the working class. And so I think we need to, otherwise we fall foul of the very confusing divisions that occurred in that Brexit election. This idea that it's North versus South, that it's Leave versus Remain, that it's somehow poor northern communities or poor towns or posh London. London isn't posh. The majority of people who live in London are working class. It's ridiculous to have to say that, but I do think some debates in our movement miss that. The working class is a majority, and so if we don't understand what the working class is, I think we'll be confused going forward. Could we have done anything differently in relation to it? I do think that establishment forces were very effective in trying to use the issue of the campaign to remain and people's concerns over Brexit as a kind of issue to separate sections of the left movement from Jeremy and the left leadership of the Labour Party. Some people were very adept at doing that. But I think we need to understand that the Brexit election was a one-off, and it's interesting that the right wing in the Labour Party and the right wing establishment more generally don't want to talk about 2017. All they want to talk about is 2019, as if the 2017 general election never happened. So we need to, I think, articulate the fact that 2019 was a very unusual election. It became the Brexit election. But 2017 is what we need to look to as the base from which to build an even bigger basis of support to be able to win a general election in the future on the basis of a transformative left programme. I think, although I disagree with the emphases that Keir gave on Brexit in his position as Shadow Brexit Secretary, at the end of the day, whatever position we took on that issue in what became a Brexit election would have caused us electoral problems. And the reason is the point I made at the beginning. We were the only major political party that represented both constituencies that overwhelmingly voted to leave and constituencies that overwhelmingly voted to remain. I don't actually think there was a simple silver bullet to the Brexit conundrum. But let's, I think, focus, if we can, on what went wrong and what went right in 2017 and how we can build upon that. Because I don't think that the unique circumstances of the Brexit election will be repeated.
Thanks, Richard. So Richard and Katie, I think, both touched on this question of geography. You know, the word red wall is a term we hear all the time now, and I'm sure we're all sick to death at it. But it is true, as Katie touched upon, and this does relate to the Brexit debate, that Labour did especially well in big, built-up city areas, and especially among younger voters. I think if you look at the way the majority of voters and various demographic brackets go, it suddenly flips from Labour to Tory. I think it's now in the sort of mid-40s. It was in the 50s in 2019. Off the back of that, I mean, how does Labour solve this problem that our major base of support is increasingly concentrated in cities, and we're doing less well in many of these post-industrial communities, areas that also voted leave, but also places like Scotland, and I'm hoping we can get to that after. So perhaps I will come back to you first, Katie. How does Labour solve that kind of increasing concentration of our support in big cities and amongst younger demographics?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that this isn't a new problem. This is a problem that has, you know, probably always been there, but definitely been there for many decades. I used to actually raise this issue when I was a Labour MP with the Whip's office about the fact that different parts of the country wanted very different things. And the focus at that time was obviously in terms of Scotland. And I used to go in and see the Labour Whips to explain why a particular proposal, perhaps, you know, supporting a welfare cap or austerity projects, you know, the Charter of Budget Responsibility was not a good idea and was a very bad idea, particularly in Scotland. And I would be told that Scotland was fine for Labour and that I should stop worrying. And I remember saying, you know, it may well be that what is required, they believed in different parts of the country for working class people was different in different, you know, parts of the country. What was right in Doncaster wasn't necessarily, you know, what went down well in Glasgow. And therefore taking a kind of tough on crime approach wasn't necessarily the kind of position that every working class community found attractive in any way whatsoever. So I don't think this is a new issue about the fact that different communities are starting in different places. I think the big issue is actually the decline of the industrial trade union movement, because actually our movement was created in communities. It was predominantly created around workplaces, and the towns and villages that were built around workplaces, that were organised, that were trade unionised, and were radicalised, and where there was political education. And I think one of the big challenges we have is actually the demise of like industrial trade unionism and workplace-based trade unionism, where people get a great deal of political education in the workplace. And many of those communities actually were the kind of communities that Richard and I have been talking about, whether that's, you know, in the north of England or in Scotland, where there was that tradition. And that tradition has weakened, and therefore I think our relationship with working class people has weakened because we no longer have that kind of base. It's definitely the case in Scotland, that, you know, that kind of, I mean, what we'd now call community organising and community activism actually is what our movement was created you know, with, and it was organic. It wasn't paid organisers that were sent in to do it. It was working class militants who had jobs down the pits that were doing it with their colleagues and were doing it in their communities. So I think the issues aren't just a challenge in relation to 2019, and actually weren't an issue specifically to do with Ed Miliband or Jeremy Corbyn. I think these are long-term challenges in terms of our relationship with working class communities. I think, however, there are new ways of organising. I think social media in particular gives us a way to actually reach into every community and into every demographic, particularly young people. I think we need to look at, the organising models round about the world and actually start really thinking about how we build that political education, but we also build that political education that actually leads people towards socialist politics and the labour movement. Why isn't it the case that, say, the climate activists that were on strike yesterday weren't holding up placards about socialism as well as climate change? That's the kind of questions I think we need to be asking in terms of, we need to accept that the world has changed from the way it was 70 years ago, and that means that the way that the Labour Party and the labour movement operates also changes.
Thanks, Katie. And before I come to Vic and Richard, I want to come back on you there, because we're talking about place here, and you talked about Scotland. Now, in England and Wales, Labour had around a 10% swing towards us in 2017. It was just under 3% in Scotland in 2017. Why is that the case? Why did that happen?
Well, I think the situation was completely different because of the independence campaign. We've spoken about the Brexit referendum, which was a 2 or 3 month campaign. But as Richard has said, it had a massive emotional resonance, I think, with a lot of people that voted leave. Many of those people really had been radicalised by the Daily Mail and the Daily Express over generations about how terrible Europe was, and then they got their opportunity to make their mark and have their say. And many of those people probably were already very alienated from all political parties, felt they had no voice politically, and that for many people was the opportunity they took where they felt that they kind of kicked the establishment in the teeth. And Scotland had something similar, but it went on for 2.5 years. The independence campaign in Scotland went on for years. And to start with, it didn't necessarily emotionally reach into every household. But after about 2 years, it started reaching into every household. And people would say to me things like, I'm rethinking everything. Everything has changed. And the independence prospectus was actually a really dangerous prospectus in the sense it wouldn't deliver. It wouldn't lead to, if you like, the emancipation of the working class in Scotland. It probably would actually lead to, probably turbo austerity. But people were so sick of the kind of politics that they saw from the House of Commons, that they saw from Westminster. They were so sick of the fact that for 70 years almost, Scotland had voted for parties that were not necessarily in government at a UK level. And they felt that this was their opportunity to try and do something different. And that was the backdrop in 2017. So a lot of the demographic that had really moved to Corbynism, if you like, the young people that were engaged and energised and excited by the politics of hope that Jeremy offered in England, actually had already been through that experience in Scotland and had gone yes. And therefore, for them, the Labour Party was a more difficult offer. I think the reason there was a move towards Labour in the last few days of the campaign was actually the prospect of a radical, transformative, socialist UK government was really exciting for lots of people in Scotland. And when people in Scotland believe that Labour can win at a UK level, that's when people in Scotland will vote Labour. Because actually, do you know what? They'd prefer a UK-wide Labour Party, social democracy, socialism on a UK-wide basis. And, when we're credible, when we offer the policies, then people in Scotland will look to us again. But frankly, they've just not thought that's where we've been in recent years.
Thanks, Katie. And we'll come back. We'll come back to that question for you, Vic, now, which I was talking about a few minutes ago about Labour doing really well in cities and especially among young people, and less so perhaps in certain post-industrial towns, certain parts of the country. What do you attribute that to? And how does Labour, or how do we as socialists confront that increasing sort of geographic or demographic divide?
Yeah, these are long-term trends which take account deindustrialisation, but also lack of opportunities that lead to people leaving towns and going elsewhere in the country. And for us as socialists to confront that, it involves community organising, which is a term that's often bandied around, which is absolutely the case. I think a lot of people are reflecting on that's what needs to be done now. But I'll give a few examples of what what that can look like. So, for example, over the pandemic, we saw mutual aid develop around people supporting each other. As I said earlier, sort of rebuilding that social fabric of solidarity between people. But also in terms of tenants unions developing at a really quick rate, for example, in cities, but why not? Why should that not be the case in towns as well? So in terms of rebuilding, that's what's going to need to happen. That hollowing out that's happened over the last 40 years is what we do to confront that. And in towns, as well as cities, you've still got these struggles, those material struggles that exist. People often forget in the last 2 elections, people under 45, by majority, still voted Labour. They still vote for a socialist government. And quite often when we talk about red wall seats, it can become a bit of a byword for reactionary politics, when actually, if we look at examples in Oldham, which is quite close to where I work in Manchester, which can be described as a red wall seat, lots of people come out against Elbit weapons factory, people coming out against imperialism, schools in red wall areas coming out in support of Palestine. People often think around the red wall in towns as being reactionary, but actually these people who they want progressive politics, but actually what we need to be able to do is not make assumptions on what people think and believe, but actually start thinking about sort of society that we want to build.
Thanks, Vic. And just while I've got you for a couple of minutes, you talked about organising on the ground and a number of your answers. And for those that don't know, Vic's a very active rank and file organiser with the NEU. And I just wanted to get that sense, without that militant trade union movement on the ground in all our communities and in all our workplaces, is there always going to be a limit to how a socialist or even left social democratic party can do in elections?
Yeah, absolutely. Trade unions are the anchor to any progressive movement, and for there to be even a socialist government, let alone it being maintained and to maintain its radicalism without a militant rank and file, is just not going to happen. Because what trade unions do, it's a school of struggle for a lot of people, for a lot of workers, opportunity to come together. All workers individually have issues at work, but then we start talking to them and having organising conversations, do it collectively. What you're doing is you're going from the individual to the collective, and for a lot of people, those are socialist values and those sort of things that we've got to develop. And once you've sort of developed that sort of structure at a workplace level, you can start looking at political education that's been mentioned before. Start thinking around some. Use an example of schools. What's the role of marketisation education? Things like Ofsted, inspections, high stakes testing. What's the role of education in terms of reproducing inequality? So you've gone from having individuals to then politicising them. And for us to even have a socialist, even a shot at a socialist government without having that necessary first step, for those workers, that's fundamentally what needs to happen. And I'll sort of finish just on this point. That's what we need to see in our trade unions. Really promising the election of Sharon Graham Unites. Her platform for turning to the workplace thing is absolutely correct. Unite itself needs to stand on its own, being strong enough to offer a counterweight against bad bosses, as well as sort of standing strong enough in terms of a trade union. That's something that we want to see replicated in other trade unions as well. Building things like rep networks to sort of build that militancy that we need to see. For example, in my union, the National Education Union, we saw an increase of almost 50,000 new members, but I think more importantly, a doubling of number of workplace reps. So the work that we're doing in our union to sort of build that militancy is a necessary stepping stone to socialism. So for those of you who aren't in a trade union, join one, but take a step further, become active and organised, and speak to your colleagues about the need to organise and to approach things collectively and through a political way as well.
Thanks, Vic. Thank you. And I'm sure we'd all agree that the NEU struggles over COVID and return to work were a really inspiring example of collective action being effective. So congratulations to you and anybody who was involved in that struggle, which is obviously still ongoing. Richard, we're going to bring it back to that question about this kind of growing divide between old and young, cities and towns. What do you think?
Well, I think we've got to be careful not to deal in cliches. For example, as someone from a northern seat that voted Leave, I get a bit sick of Labour right figures basically saying, by and large, people in my constituency are this, that and the other. Anybody would think the way that some people talk about it. The North is full of, reactionary racists. It's not at all. And remember how enthused people in our communities were by that transformative programme in 2017. And those policies that connected with them were policies which would lift living standards in the North. The Northern Investment Bank, the Regional Investment Bank, the increase in the minimum wage, full employment rights from day one, all of these things linked to people's day-to-day experiences. So I think that some of the conversations about the so-called red wall are problematic. It's being used by people in the Labour right to try and push us down a kind of blue Labour line where it's about faith, family, and the flag. That's patronising towards people in the North. It's offensive towards people in the North. It's offensive towards people in the working class in general. We can connect with people, regardless of age, regardless of location, by having policies which are practical solutions to the problem that they face. So let's move away from these unappealing caricatures of northern working class communities. And I think, by the way, this is one of the problems the Labour leadership has. They're trying to win back the so-called red wall seats in all the wrong ways. You won't win back those seats or gain more of them by thinking that what people really want is a leader who has photos eating fish and chips, a leader who has photos drinking beer a bit too often, a leader who always has, the Union Jack behind him. Is that what they think people in the North want? Or who do you want to, what will make you vote Labour? Well, fish and chips, beer and Union Jack flags. Come on. It's all about transformative politics.
And as I've done a sort of an individual question to Katie and Vic, I wanted to put a broader one to you, Richard. You spent a lot of time in the shadow cabinet, involved in major decisions over Brexit, policy, big strategy discussions. What was that experience like? But how did you feel that role related to your role as a constituency MP and as well as somebody responsive to the movement?
Well, I still consider myself an activist. Before I was elected as an MP for my own community in 2015, I used to do in my spare time what I do all day and all night now, supporting campaigns, trying to sort people in the local area, linking up with trade union campaigns, social movements and the anti-war movement. But when I was in the shadow cabinet, obviously I had to develop a plan of how we would run the Ministry of Justice when we had a Labour government. And that was my role. Obviously, as well as that, I was trying to link up with the wider movements outside Parliament and link up with party members across the country as well, and yes, do my job as a constituency MP. But in a struggle, everyone's got their role, and everyone's role is important. We've got to be clear that what the left's about, and this is, I think, what's changed in the last few years as well. The left isn't about us just getting together and deciding what we agree about and having a good time, although that's important. The left is also about being in a position to take state power, being in a position to become the government, being in the position to run one of the biggest economies in the world, being in a position to be deciding what our interventions will be on foreign policy in the United Nations Security Council. And so my role within that was to work out and plan and have costed what we were going to do in the Ministry of Justice if we came to power. But everyone in here had an important role as well. And without any of us playing our role, whether it's people in the shadow cabinet who's got the role of developing a plan for what we do in government and the policies to help us win government, or whether it's rank and file activists, trade unionists, people campaigning in our communities, we were all vital as a collective, because for the many, not the few, it wasn't just about our slogan, a slogan about our policies. It's also a slogan that picks up on the essence of our movement, because it was a mass movement, and in the mass movement we all have a role. So I didn't see any contradiction in there. I just saw that my job in the movement was doing that, and other people had different jobs, but we all had to do our job. People in Parliament, people outside Parliament, all had to do our job together, support each other, fulfil our individual responsibilities as part of the collective to get that change we so needed.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you. You touched on big issue there, state power, government. And there's an article by Jeremy Gilbert in the aftermath of the 2019 election, and he said that people simply didn't believe we were big enough. And what he meant by that was if we had have gotten to government, we would have been smashed by capital, by finance, by the right-wing media, and we would have collapsed. Now, do any of you agree or disagree with that sentiment or that statement? And if it is true that we would have been smashed in government, as a lot of historic left-wing governments have, whether Chile or Mitterrand in France, what can we do about that? And I'll put that first to Vic, perhaps, if that's all right.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth in what Jeremy said there in terms of a concrete analysis of the sort of balance of forces if we were to have won the election, but it also sort of points towards what needs to happen in order for that not to happen. I think it's absolutely right that we're thinking about what the forces of capital would do in response, and we saw it as well, didn't we, in terms of the response from the media and the press, and as well as capital threatening to capital flight, for example, if there was a Labour government elected. So our response to that is to make sure that we're strong enough to resist that, and that's got to be through building ourselves at a local level. Okay, so that means building active, militant, rank and file trade unions. It means it's building tenants' unions. It's about developing people's understanding around imperialism. Andrew mentioned Chile there, for example. It's about sort of understanding that the work we do as a left is not just to see as part of the Labour left, but to sort of see as part of the wider movement. And that means approaching things in its totality, seeing struggles wherever they are and sort of doing as much as possible to bring them all together, whether that's against racism, imperialism, transphobia, all of this as much as possible, so that when we're in a position to approach state power, it's important that we can't ignore it, particularly with the climate crisis, is that we're going to be ready this time.
Thanks, Vic. Katie?
I don't think the reason that we lost the 2019 general election was that many people thought that we weren't big enough. I think, there were a lot of suggestions, for example, that we'd be smashed by the state, that there'd be a military coup against a Corbyn government. These were real things that were put forward, but I don't think they were the major reasons that people didn't come to us in 2019. I think probably the criticism that we were trying to achieve too much and that we hadn't argued through our positions over a long enough time, I think is a reasonable view, that it was a sort of shopping list that every day there was a different policy announced, and perhaps we needed to be campaigning for those policies over 2 or 3 days rather than 2 or 3 months. I think the issue of free broadband is a really good example. That really was maybe something that if we'd argued through and explained to people and campaigned on and put leaflets out about and did work around over maybe 2 years, actually could have been a huge vote winner for us. So, I think if there's any lessons, it's perhaps that, I don't think we should actually adopt this establishment party political kind of political management view that you announce all your policies during an election campaign and that you hide all your policies until then. I think, we actually had a huge offer in 2019, but to announce it all during the general election, I think was unrealistic. And actually people didn't even know what we were offering because there was too much. So I think, there's lessons to be learned there. And I would say one of the things about the 2015 leadership campaign was actually a lot of the policies that we adopted were actually the policies that the Socialist Campaign Group have been campaigning on for many, many years. They weren't new ideas particularly. In fact, it's when new ideas were put forward that sometimes we got into trouble, things like women-only rail carriages and things like that, which many of us had never campaigned for, because they weren't thought through, whereas policies such as nationalising the railways and taxing the rich and what do we do about tax avoidance were issues that we'd campaigned on for a long time. The unions had done loads of research into, we were really thought through. So I think that's the big lesson, actually, in terms of practical issues is, we shouldn't announce things late. We should be campaigning on them and working with people on them. And, so by the time of the election, people know what we stand for and that we're not telling them on the doorstep what we stand for, they're telling us.
Thanks, Katie. I'll come to you next, Richard.
Well, I don't think that the reason we lost was that people analysed it and came to the conclusion, I like these ideas, but I don't think this movement is strong enough to take on the forces of the capitalist states. If people were analysing it to that level, I think we'd have been in a very different position indeed. It does sound a bit like a kind of left intellectualised version of you had too many policies. And I don't think we had too many policies. I do think that we ended up being seen as a kind of establishment force, or rather not insurgent enough. And that was unfair. And that's because in 2017, we were out and about at the massive rallies that Jeremy and others were speaking at. But because of the whole Brexit issue, we became seen more and more as kind of being there, gripping the dispatch box late at night with the latest parliamentary wrangle or ruse to get around the Brexit conundrum. So we ended up looking, and maybe there's nothing we could have done about this, but we ended up looking a lot more like creatures of Westminster rather than insurgent anti-establishment force than we should have done. And into that, Boris Johnson somehow managed to convince people that he, the person from Eton, the Bullingdon club boy, was somehow anti-establishment himself with this slogan, get Brexit done. Somehow he was sticking it to the EU establishment, the Westminster establishment, the so-called liberal establishment. So I think that was something I reflect upon. So I don't think it was that people didn't think we were big enough to take on the state and implement these policies. But in relation to that, I think we could have been bigger. You mentioned Chile earlier. What's key is that we learn the lesson of the importance of linking up with social movements. The Labour Party is not a social movement. It's not meant to be. It's a political party that's meant to take state power. But it has to rest on the base and have a dialogue and involvement with people from social movements. Social movements has to give the party that's trying to take governmental state power its energy. You mentioned Chile. Look what happened in Bolivia. The left president was ousted. People were tortured. People were disappeared. People were abused. But with the support of the social movement that they'd always stuck with, they're now back in power. The left is back in power in Bolivia. And I think we can draw a lesson of hope from that. And the lesson has to be that we need to build and build a wider movement, a bigger movement, have further connections with social movements as well. But going back to a point that was made earlier about political education, we should never overestimate how advanced the movement is, because you can get carried away with yourself if you're not careful. So, for example, I never thought that when Jeremy got elected, that suddenly meant that there were 400,000 Benites in the Labour Party. It wasn't suddenly the case that people all had Jeremy's politics from A to Z, or Tony Benn's politics, or John McDonnell's politics, or Dan's politics from A to Z. He'd captured their imagination with an anti-austerity programme, straight talking, the politics of transformative change. So I think political education is very important, because whilst we recognise that not everyone was suddenly a fully ideologically developed socialist, we need to do something about that. You know, we need to offer political education, offer opportunities for discussion, disagreement, thinking, and that's why the World Transformed is so important. And perhaps it can help us to avoid some of the mistakes that were made in the last leadership election. Because I do know, obviously, people, great people on the left who voted for Keir in the leadership election, and I don't know any of them that don't feel let down. They saw those 10 pledges, they took them at face value, they thought it was great, they voted for him, and now the disillusion. But we all learn from experiences, don't we? I didn't back Keir for leader, but we all learn from experiences.
Thanks so much on that. And just touching on Richard's point, at Momentum, one of our roles, which we see as being crucial, is being one of those bridges from the party to movements on the ground that are struggling. So if you're not a Momentum member, please do consider joining, because that's a key part of our strategy going forward for the next 12 months, as well as organising the left in the party, as we're now doing on conference floor. Now, I'm going to ask one more question to everybody. I'll just ask you to keep contributions to a minute and a half, and then we'll get out to do a bit of a Q&A, give you a chance to ask some questions or make comments of your own. And taking together everything we've said about some of the lessons, I want to think about the priorities for the next 12 months. What sort of key priorities would you focus on? It could be 12 months, could even be the next 5 years if you believe that's the more appropriate timeline. But what should we as the Labour left and also the wider left be focusing our energy on? And I think I'll go first to Vic on this.
Yeah, I think our priorities need to be really focused on building coalitions, coalitions resistance. I think the Kill the Bill movement's been really instructive in its ability to bring together different organisations involved around counter-policing. So that could be people involved around no police in schools, cops off campus, borders, detentions, and that's a really good example of anti-capitalists coming together in a way that builds those individual organisations, but overall what you're doing is you're amplifying the demands of the movement as much as possible. So I think our priority needs to be to sort of see ourselves, whether it's the Labour left or Momentum, as individual actors as part of a wider ecosystem, and really focusing on organising around differences in order to build socialism. And I sort of said at the start, we're here to transform the world, aren't we? I don't want to live under capitalism anymore. And for example, with the climate crisis, there isn't time. Okay, so we need to be serious around, organising for power in the workplace, in the community, against landlordism, against imperialism, against the whole thing. Yeah.
Thanks, Vic. Katie?
I believe our priorities should be on the policy programme and on defending the bold, radical policies that Jeremy Corbyn and others developed between 2015 and 2019. We have potentially some really hard times coming. Labour needs to be very firmly in an anti-austerity place, arguing to defend and extend the living standards of working class people and working class communities. We need to make sure we're in the right place on civil liberties, and we can talk about this in more detail, but some of the positions that Labour has been taking in Parliament are not acceptable and are not defending the interests of working people. We need to welcome when there are positive policy announcements. The work that Andy MacDonald has been doing that's being announced today is bold, it's radical, it's the kind of territory we should be on. Ed Miliband has been defending the nationalisation and public ownership of the energy sector. That's something that we should be defending, extending and campaigning on. So without going through a shopping list of the policies that we should be campaigning for, we need to make it clear that we demand and expect and will fight for a Labour Party that has radical, transformative, socialist policies that will empower the working class, will empower working people, and will ensure that we have a more equal, freer, and a society where people can really have the kind of democratic say over every aspect of their lives that we were talking about earlier.
Well, we'll only achieve our priorities, which I'll come on to in a second, if we have confidence. And I do think we need to have confidence. We've been kicked about for a long time, but we should have confidence. We should have confidence in the ideas of the left movement, because as society faces these huge crises, whether it be the public health crisis, the climate crisis, the living standards crisis, or anything else, actually, it's the left that are coming up with the practical policies that deal with these huge era-defining crises. And what have the right of the Labour Party come up with? Tony Blair stopped being Prime Minister back in 2017, and in the 14 years since then, his current within the Labour Party have basically come up with nothing. 10,000 words of a policy-free zone recently, for example, that pamphlet. So we need to be confident. What we need to prioritise is coming up with these policies, pushing these policies, whether it's on a wealth tax, an adult social care service built upon the founding principles of the NHS, actual sufficient action to tackle climate catastrophe. All of these things should be our priorities. And by taking a lead on policy, we can show the leadership as a left in the way that Jeremy and John and Diane and Kate and others showed the leadership in the run-up to Jeremy becoming leader of the Labour Party. Because in all those hard years, the Socialist Campaign Group MPs, left trade unionists, left members, left social movements, they all showed that leadership. They kept that flame alive. And I know it's difficult for people at the moment, but actually the context has never been more appropriate for radical left transformative policies, because it's not just what we would like, it's what's necessary given the scale of the crises that we face. So if people have chance, I'd encourage them to look at the 10 policies the Socialist Campaign Group have demanded that Keir announces as an immediate programme, so it's not exhaustive, an immediate programme now to tackle the living standards crisis that people are facing. We thought we'd try and help to fill that policy void. So if you have a look and see what you think, that would be great. But have confidence, push policies, but as well, of course, we've got to support each other and defend each other and the left inside the party and outside the party from attack. The reason we're being attacked, by the way, is because they know that what I've just said is true, that we do have the answers. If we were irrelevant, if our policies were pie in the sky, if they could never gain public support, then do you know what? They'd leave us alone. And they're certainly not leaving us alone. So we need to defend each other. And the left movement, not because we want to be defined by internal party disputes which shouldn't be taking place in the first place, because they shouldn't be attacking us, but because it's a necessary step, not only to do the right thing, but to move forward with that necessary socialist policy agenda.
Thanks, Richard. So we're going to go into a bit of an audience Q&A. You can ask a question to one of our panellists. You can make a comment. I just ask that you try and keep your contributions to around 60 seconds. The way we're going to do this is we've got a volunteer who's kindly going to come and bring a microphone to the person who wants to speak. And if there's multiple hands, I will point in your direction, and we'll try and get through everybody. We've got about 25 minutes for this, so this should give us a good time for a bit of discussion. And I'll go first with yourself. And there's going to be a microphone coming your way now if you want to stand up.
Thank you. Great session. So, 2017, Wimbledon was one of the biggest votes for Remain in the country. I think we were the third. And yet, in 2017, without having a candidate who campaigned, we came this close because of the integrity and because of that 2017 policy. And that election, Brexit didn't matter. By 2019, it was huge. And actually, it was a failure to allow it to dominate. The fact that we couldn't show people that what's happening to our planet is 100 times more important than a trade deal. The fact that people were starving in Wimbledon, a rich area. We didn't do that, and that's why we lost. But my question is, we were undermined every step of the way by Labour councils acting as Tory councils. We could win those arguments on the doorsteps about the manifesto very quickly. Very quickly, we could get the new industrial, the Green Deal won. We could explain how about council housing, how we were after the war, we were the poorest we'd ever been, and yet we built homes for heroes. We set up the NHS. We could do that, but the MPs who undermined us every step of the way, proudly, who actually asked people to vote for other parties, that is why the movement lost confidence. That is why. Now, I didn't join Labour Party to fight internal enemies. I'm not interested in it. But what are we going to do? Because they cost us. They cost us dear. And we cannot, those young people that we let down, those people who joined our movement because they believed change was possible. And those MPs did everything they could to kill that, and we cannot allow that. We cannot tolerate it. So I need to know. I don't want to be involved in internal politics, and frankly, that's why those members who joined, those members who saw Jeremy's integrity, who flocked to say, "What can I do?" Because, and it wasn't radical. Actually, the things that we were promising were things I grew up with. You know, council housing, decent jobs, not shit jobs. Those things were, and NHS. those things we are really actually very central. Decent railways, all of that. So those people flock to us. But when they saw how we lost, they've now fallen away. And in all good conscience, I can't ask them to come back either, because I look at the rump our CLP has turned into. And as I say, we cannot have Labour councils carrying out the Tory work. That's what's going to kill us.
Thank you. I'll offer it to our panellists if you'd like to add on to that. Anything to add? Katie?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. People don't get involved in the Labour Party to get involved in faction fights, and I think the Labour Party has got a massive problem in terms of how divided it is. I think it's a cultural problem, and I think it's something we've all got a responsibility to try and address in terms of how we actually create a movement where people treat each other with respect and in a comradely way. I mean, as I said earlier, I worked within the machine, and in fact, I was one of the main targets of a lot of the kind of very unpleasant attacks in terms of, the WhatsApp messages, etc. And it was, a situation where people were incredibly nice to your face, but clearly behind your back, people were being incredibly unpleasant. And I think, all of us have got a responsibility there in terms of, if we believe that the Labour Party should be a broad church, if we believe that we want to be a mass movement, and those are massive issues, can I say, to be debated. But, that's what the Labour Party was created to be. It was a wide range of people that came together to create the Labour Party, from revolutionary socialists to Fabians. It was, that's a discussion in its own right. But, if we are going to be together with people with different views, which is what we are, the working class of different views, then we have to learn how we debate with each other. And that was something that was a key theme in the democracy review in terms of, how do we conduct ourselves? How do we build a movement where people can be really honest, have those debates, educate themselves, and build a movement that will transform society?
Thanks, Katie. I'll take a few more contributions from... Yes.
Thanks very much. Well, thanks for that really useful contribution. What I'd say is expect struggle. I know that's no consolation. I don't want to start paraphrasing Winston Churchill by saying all I can promise is blood, sweat and tears. But the reality is, in our society, everything is contested. The politics of your trade union is contested. The trade union movement founded by the working class. The Labour Party, founded by the working class, is a contested territory. Everything is a contested territory in our society. So I'm afraid it's going to continue. We've just got to make sure that next time we win. And people should expect it, I'm afraid, to happen again. Because when the establishment gets scared, the establishment becomes hostile. It becomes hostile in a major political party. It becomes hostile in the media. It becomes hostile in wider society. So I'm afraid we've got to steel ourselves for that and support each other. I mean, I know that some people talk about forming new political parties. I'm totally against that. But for those of you who might be thinking about that, let me give you a word of warning. If you formed a new political party, if it somehow, at some point, got within touching distance of taking state power, which I'm afraid it probably won't, then the exact same problems we had in the Labour Party would recur, because it's nothing to do with the precise character of the Labour Party. It's to do with what the establishment, wherever it's found, does when you are a threat to a rotten status quo. In the same way, if people formed a new party and MPs started getting elected and councillors started getting elected, obviously opportunists would start joining. People who want a career. That's how it works, I'm afraid. So we need to support each other, stick together, and get more involved, actually, with the matter of council selections, for example. When I stood for deputy leader, one of the most popular things I said, apart from with the council leaders when I went to the Labour Local Government Conference, was the idea that leaders of Labour groups wouldn't be selected by the Labour councillors, would be selected by the wider Labour membership. And actually, Labour council selections are something where rank and file members can have a real effect. I see a comrade shaking their head. If we don't think we can get a left Labour council candidate elected, they should give up on trying to take on the British establishment. It's very marked the fact that you can get council selections taking place where maybe only 15 or 20 members turn up. So we can get great council candidates selected. We can change the balance of power within Labour groups and Labour councils. Similarly, let's look at the fact that in the Parliamentary Labour Party, obviously I'd prefer there to be far more left MPs, and we lost some great left MPs and didn't win with some great left candidates at the last election. But the Socialist campaign group of Labour MPs is now bigger than it's been for decades. You know, that's no small thing. So let's not give up hope, but let's not expect, unfortunately, that some of the unpleasant tactics and behaviour by the establishment won't recur again. The only way to escape it, I'm afraid, is by becoming irrelevant. And none of us want to become irrelevant, and we're not irrelevant.
Thanks, Richard. And just to say that Momentum runs a couple of times a year a Future Councillors programme. We take on a cohort of about 50 each time. We give them the advice and the support they need to navigate the selection processes. While it's totally true now, more than ever, council candidates are being stitched off lists at an aggressive pace. It's also true that we're still getting hundreds of council candidates through under the radar across the country. And that word under the radar is key. It does take a little bit of kind of tactical considerations nowadays to get through these processes, but we are still getting people from the processes. Momentum's Future Councillor programme, get in touch with us. If you've never had any thought of doing it before, start thinking about it now, because we need good people in local government. I'll take some more questions. If everyone just wants to put the hand up so I can get an idea of how many we're looking at, we'll try to get through as many as possible. What I'll do is I'll take this gentleman at the first, then I'll come to you next. If you could keep it to about 60 seconds if you can. You've got a mic coming to you from behind there.
Yeah, I've actually done one of the Future Council programmes. It was a good thing to do, so yeah, I would advise anyone to do them as well. My question is, this session's called What Can We Learn from the Corbyn Era? We've just heard from Jackie about the situation that with Labour bureaucracies up and down the country, what's actually happening to the gains that have been made over the last 5 years. And if we look at what's happening in the conference centre over there, the rule changes that are being proposed, which essentially eradicate all the work Katie did on the democracy review and also further entrench power within that ever-vanishingly small number of Labour MPs who are completely separated from what the rest of the country wants, and an ideological position which is 2 decades old and completely unappealing to most people. So my question is the major lesson that we should have learnt from the Corbyn era that we need to be far more ruthless next time, and actually we need to be, and actually the thing I really want to know from both Katie and Richard is, if these rules go through, which we don't know whether they're going to or not, what is the plan next? Because it locks the left out from any leadership contest until we change the rules again. So what's the plan, and how do we move forward with the same ruthlessness that these people have?
Thank you. I'll come to Vic first, then I'll come to Katie and Richard, and we'll do 30 seconds each, if that's all right. Start with Vic.
Seconds. Yeah, just really quickly on that. And you're absolutely right. Look, it was so obvious. No, the right have been humiliated. They were humiliated for years. As soon as they got any power, that of course they're going to change the rules as quickly as possible. They shouldn't be surprised what's going on. This is what always the plan was. And it's a real shame. People always were like one of the what ifs. The hesitation went over managed reselection. No, the fact we thought we could ever, be under the same tent as people like Luke Akehurst. The guy is a war criminal in terms of support for wars, and he's an arms dealer. He's an imperialist. This is a guy who's got an ear to the leadership. People like Matt Pound, really awful people. So we need to be ruthless, and we've got to be strong about our politics and really articulate that. But we've got to be prepared that we might be shut out of the left leadership in terms of the Labour Party. So we've got to build that independent power of us as a working class. And that means, and this is the big thing a lot of people have said, what do we do now? Steine's the leader. God, just build something, come along with comrades and struggle and work these things out. Is it going to be a tenants union? Is it going to be a momentum group? Is it keeping your left CLP group going? As long as we're still working together, developing each other, still politicising working class people, outward facing, building, we're going to be ready, okay? But, the conditions of Corbynism haven't disappeared. In fact, they're going to heighten and get worse with the climate crisis in particular. Okay, so even if the worst happens with rule change, etc., no, that's not the end of socialism. Okay, no, 150 years ago, people organised in far worse conditions. Look what they built. We can build it again.
Thanks, Vic.
I'm not sure ruthless is the right word. I think decisive. And I think, we should learn lessons from how perhaps some other leaderships in the Labour Party have operated. And it is perfectly normal when a new leader gets elected that they bring in their own general secretary and that they ask the party be run in the style that the new leader has a mandate to do. And as I've said before, Jeremy was elected with an absolutely overwhelming mandate to deliver straight-talking, honest politics. And he had the right to say from day one that was the style in which he wished the Labour Party to be run. So I think that is a lesson to be learnt. But actually, probably we knew that before, and it just wasn't delivered. I would say that in many ways, a lot of the lessons, those kind of big lessons, are probably something socialists have spoken about for generations, and these are just illustrative examples of why actually what people have said for a long time in terms of how the labour movement works, how trade union bureaucracies work, why actually it is necessary to insist that if you get elected with a democratic mandate, that you have a responsibility to the people who have elected you to make sure that style of leadership is implemented. And that isn't about being nasty to individuals. It really isn't. And it isn't about being ruthless. It's about being democratic and saying, well, actually, we have a responsibility to deliver what, the leadership has been elected to do.
Richard.
There's a famous phrase, isn't there? He who leaves a revolution half done digs his own grave. But also, I would say that, and that just applies to the Electoral College in Keir, but I'd also make the point that the balance of forces wasn't there for us to be as ruthless, in inverted commas, as the Blairites in the Labour Party are being now. People do forget that for much of Jeremy's leadership, we didn't even have a majority on the NEC, and of course, we didn't have a majority within the PLP. So to get into a position where we can be decisive and make permanent the change of the Labour Party into the vehicle as a left-led party of social transformative policies, we need to do what sometimes seems pretty dull, organising first, getting more left council candidates elected, more left MPs elected, more left candidates for Parliament elected, and more left general secretaries elected in our trade unions, because that unglamorous work was done for many years. Like, for example, I was selecting my home seat, a so-called safe Labour seat. It belonged to Dennis Healey, and I won on the first ballot. And that was before the big influx of left members. And I made clear that I was a left candidate. Rebecca Long-Bailey got selected. Other people did as well. And if it hadn't been for that unglamorous work, there wouldn't have been sufficient MPs to get Jeremy on the ballot paper at that critical historical moment which came around. So actually, whilst change seems to happen in an instant, the seeds of change are sown through lots of unglamorous work so that you're ready for that moment when the big change can occur. So I do think we should draw lessons. But I think a lesson that the wider movement has learnt actually from this is not to expect so-called fairness. I do think some lovely people getting involved in politics for the first time thought that all you've got to do is elect a left-wing leader of the Labour Party. The right wing then go, oh, we didn't win this time. Better look next time, lads, and we'll get behind you and have another go in 5 years. That's not how it works. And even if it were, it wouldn't be the case of then just putting popular policies to the country. The establishment, everywhere it's found, would move heaven and earth to stop a left government. But I also think we need to consider ourselves lucky. I mentioned Bolivia before. Their socialist president got removed by a military coup. Their socialist politicians were tortured. Their activists were disappeared. Now, they didn't go disappearing. They gained power again with the support of the social movement. So I know it feels difficult, but we can win again. And it's because we can win again that those right-wingers won't leave us alone.